everybody. Welcome. It's a foggy day or evening in the garden today. And I've been listening to the living place and learning. Might be a little noisy wind for a bit. Maybe I should walk with the wind on the high terrain. And if I'll walk in a circular path in the lower terrain, it may be easier not to generate noise as I walk against the wind. Except that into the wind is different from against. As people who use sailing vessels understand viscerally, because they've extended, just as we do when we ride a bicycle or walk or drive a car, they've extended their interiority over and beyond a vessel. Now, the language is inexact, and I want us to remain aware of how the language is a series of games that most of us have not been trained to understand in a deep way. Right now I'm walking into the direction of the wind. However, it's not blasting me in the face and probably isn't perceptible on the microphone. When we begin to extend our awareness, which is something that takes practice, particularly in the contexts many of us are used to finding ourselves in, moment to moment, day to day, task to task, problem to problem, loss to loss, benefit to benefit. It takes practice to understand in a way that we can enact how to relate intelligently. And when the person who is sailing a boat is doing this, they're not merely extending their awareness and maybe even their idea of self to some degree to the boat. They're extending it to the weather, to transformations in the context, the water. And in that sense, they're establishing a superposition above how consciousness and purpose and orientation and perspective would otherwise be different and perhaps more collapsed in other circumstances, such as walking. We have a unique library of capacities as human beings. For awareness, which I'll here propose comes before consciousness, is proto to consciousness. And consciousness can be understood, or I'll ask that we think of it this way, as proto to cognition, which is more or less formal, conceptual, linguistic ways of thinking. Now there's going to be a little wind. Maybe in the mic. Our species is vulnerable, and the fact of our being representational animals, the fact that we can depart sensing, active sensing, relational integrity, awareness, hey there, into abstractions and models and representations. It's really important to understand that we are trained to engage in this departure from childhood. And some of us sustain an awareness of this. And we have practices that bring us back into active sensing, relational integrity, conscious integrity, cognitive integrity, so that we, like someone sailing a ship in waters within seemingly invisible currents, we can navigate in ways that, if not intrinsically beneficial, cause less harm. Are less wrong as we go along. And words like harm and wrong, these terms represent very extreme collapses of concept, right, to a derivative that's deceptive because it takes a field, a constellation of innumerable situations and participants and processes and histories and futures, and collapses them down to a deliverable: harm, wrong. And what's lost there is the actual diversity of relationship and opportunity, threat, benefit. The degree to which things are good or bad intrinsically may not even exist. It's a shadow that language casts upon our capacities to purposefully disambiguate something that has attracted our attention or concern. And many of us, as we age, crystallize toward habits that cause something like decoherence in sensing, metabolism, relationships, participation, identity, awareness. And this is in part because we have acquired a library of habits whose character is not intrinsically perverse, yet our practice of these habits, our common collapse into these habits, certainly is, particularly as we move up from individuals to groups to collectives to societies and institutions and so on. Daniel Schmachtenberger was talking about something he referred to as the perverse imperative complex. And without saying precisely what he means, I want to talk about how it is that we moderns find ourselves in a complex manifold of perverse imperative complexes, and in fact, not merely human beings, but life on Earth is presently in direct competition with those complexes and is losing. Human intelligence, the possibility of it, is falling off a cliff. And this is particularly true at the scale of our collectives, our societies, institutions, corporations, and so on. For the power to obliterate the possibility of intelligence lies not presently with individual humans in small groups, though they have a role. It lies with an order of thing, an order of process, that we can learn to recognize and distinguish in a range of ways that are helpful or not. We live in a time where certain very important roots that affect all other roots and all derivations have become corrupted, catastrophically corrupted. These are roots like the world, dreaming, person, we, intelligence. Well, this is just a small selection, but I'm going to talk about two of them briefly. The first is we. There are two distinct ways we can suppose the existence of a we that I'm currently interested in. one moment. I'll take some examples, so I think it'll be helpful. So let us suppose for a moment that there's been an accident. We'll call it an automobile accident. And the people involved are motivated to help each other rather than cast blame. They recognize that everybody's at risk. Some people are injured. So they form a coherent, momentary union, probably without having to actually talk a lot about it immediately. I've been involved in such unions, and they act as a unity with and for each other. So you can see active sensing, participation, meaningful participation, awareness, cognition, modeling, and understanding all become integrated, right? We end up with an integral union. At least briefly, while they work together in an attempt to protect each other and resolve an unexpected, catastrophic situation. There are other examples that have a much smaller interval, such as when two strangers pass each other on the street and light up with authentic smiles as they make eye contact. That's a very informal we. However, when in language, when I extend the word we to include all people, or everyone in the United States, or everyone in California, that's actually the opposite of a meaningful use of the word we. And so this is the problem that I want to point at in our thinking and our language. A we that doesn't exist because it was never formed intentionally. When I use this word, I am not referring to the presence of union or communion or mutual concern or shared fate, shared risk, shared opportunity. I'm referring to the absence of those things. And where did they go? How did they disappear? They disappeared into representations. California, the United States, the humans of Earth. And this kind of disappearance is an opportunistic wonderland for what I'll refer to as false collectives. Nations, corporations, institutions. And these false collectives are continuously intruding in the space of relation and active sensing, awareness, consciousness that might otherwise produce fruitful results. And they're converting that space to commodities the same way a logging company converts a forest to lumber and sells it. So you can see that the fake collectives, while they do produce short-term benefits and convenience, quote unquote, and opportunity for individuals, they also produce monumental constellations of damage. Damage to the foundations of life on Earth, of human awareness, of the possibility of participation with integrity. They replace, over time, more and more deeply, at an ever-increasing pace, the foundations of life on Earth, our humanity, and the origins and potentials for human intelligence. And what they replace them with is fictions, often codified in language, i.e. the Constitution. We're still using an operating system from the 1800s in 2020 for a nation. No one would think, if they were paying attention, that that doesn't represent a vicious cascade of frame collapses. It has to continue to function. So, as individual humans and as a species, we're competing against something like the absence of our integral conscious relation with ourselves, our lives, each other, nature, what we refer to as resources. And by the way, that word's important in the sense that it means, if you imagine a swimming beetle under the water, or a dolphin or a whale, right? That rises up to get oxygen and then returns back to its underwater existence for a while until it needs oxygen again. It is resourcing its origin, the moment, the span of its existence, its capacity for participation and active sensing, authentically, just as I do when I inhale. And we can see very easily the intimate link between the capacity to inhale and to exhale, and existence. If that process is very briefly interrupted, I die. And there aren't too many fictions that can intrude there that are survivable. But the fake collectives in whose behaviors and character and repercussions we are enmeshed, they don't breathe. They aren't beings. They are things. They are processes that convert humans to lethal and catastrophic defection from the essence of being itself, from life, from resourcing, and they replace those potentials with ever deadlier and more confusing and more disembodied processes, relationships, jobs, tasks, errands, imperatives. And this is what Daniel's talking about when he refers to the perverse imperative complex. So, the word we, where it is not employed in a sense that's trustworthy, intelligent, integrative, integral, sincere, based on actual sensing and agreements, not on representations. Comprises the shadow of its absence. So what is being pointed at, primarily, when this word we is used, particularly to complain about something that's gone wrong or that's obviously bad, it's backwards. An authentic we group was never formed, and instead, an ever more accelerating and layered replacement of false collectivity was imposed and pursued and enacted. If humans become confused about concepts so simple as we, so that when they make this noise with their face, they're actually referring to its opposite, but are not aware of that, then those humans have lost their minds. Not in the figurative sense, in a concrete sense. They've so lost touch with relation, which really is the origin of identity. Identity is not explicit or implicit in things like trees and gardens and birds. Identity is something humans derive through a process of frame collapse according to the purpose that initiated that process. And very, very few of us are aware of this. And I could talk at great length about this, but I want to say a simple thing. As we collapse from the position above identification and identity toward identification and identity, one of the primary motivations is utility. What can I do with the thing? What does the thing do? What is the value of the derivative? What is the meaning? This what, where, why, how, who, when, and which, the 7 ions of quest. Those are ladders we use to climb down from the superposition above identification, above declaration, into roles. And as that collapse proceeds, if it's misguided, which it so very often is in our time, we're going to experience damage. And we will lose what I'll refer to as degrees of freedom, which are uniquely distinguishable dimensions or domains of liberty. A really good example is a bird has both wings and feet. It can walk. And when it lands, it gives up degrees of freedom for the relatively clumsy capacity to walk. So it loses momentarily. It's not in the superposition, right? It comes down to the subposition, walks around there, maybe grabs some food, and then re-enters the superposition. When we play the cognitive game of what is that, what's it for, what's its value, is it a threat, is it an opportunity, we give up degrees of freedom as we collapse down into the questions. But we at least are embodied. The fictional collectives on which our lives depend and within which our minds and consciousness are very dangerously restructured for the most part today. Their game is interesting to deconstruct. Their game is to produce the appearance of value, meaning, benefit, opportunity, and to offload the damage that their perverse imperatives, right, like burn down the Amazon rainforest and plant soybeans, or whatever other monoculture you like. They are false collectives being abstract, disembodied processes that convert humans to membership and participation. Not only do they not care, caring, authentic caring, is impossible for constructs. Constructs don't care. They don't breathe. They're a lot like tumors. They'll kill the organs of the entire body just to propagate more quickly and more profusely. Metastasis. So in Daniel's language, the false collectives that we presently live under the rule of, primarily, are comparable to broad-scale metastatic oncogenesis, cancer formation. And just like cancer cells, they don't care. Their goal is reproduction, dominance of terrain, and very quickly that destroys the body. And of course that cures the cancer because there's nowhere left to externalize the damage. That's what kills the body in cancer. The damage can't be offloaded anymore into the basis of life on Earth, into the orienting anchors of being or intelligence. And that's where the damage has been being offloaded for a long, long time. So we humans have this conceivable gift, representational cognition, that actually acts like a monster production factory and has as its fulfillment the successful obliteration of life on Earth, or at the very least the successful obliteration of the biosphere, possibly humans, relatively likely. We're among the more delicate organisms on Earth. We're extremely delicate, in fact. The thing that makes us look robust is technology. That's what we use to do the damage that we offload into nature and our own minds and relationships and failures to form meaningful, intelligent collectivity and so on. That's a very grim prognosis. However, it helps us, I think, presuming that us is not merely a fiction. It helps us in that it helps to explain why our species is insane. We can make tools, we can dominate terrain, we can continue to dominate it up until very recently by hiding the damage in nature, which of course it's hidden only from our awareness. It doesn't get rid of the damage. In fact, damage hidden in nature comes directly back to us in a feedback loop because we are nature. So there's no place to hide the damage. That's one of the fictions of representational cognition, right? We can bury the radioactive waste. So I spoke a little bit about how our language, many of the fundamental anchors of meaning, words like intelligence, world, life, human, we, dream, food, mother, father, family, people, mice. These words have become, in common usage, they point away from what they once pointed toward. As our species has developed into more sophisticated capacities with technology and representation, we failed to notice that the fundamental roots from which meaning arises in relation were being corrupted. And perhaps one of the very important, all of these little anchor words are important, I call them holophores, but the one that I want to examine briefly at the moment is intelligence. It's very difficult to provide a overarching definition for intelligence because the nature of what is meant to me by this word is usually local to a specific group of people or a person or a situation or a circumstance. I'm not sure I'm equipped to broadly define it, but I can say things about what it isn't. It isn't tearing your boat apart at sea. And the fact that you can tear the boat apart and make a book or a gun or a computer will not help you. Once you've torn enough of the boat apart, the sea will swallow you whole. That will be that. So you could make it look for a little while like ripping the boat apart was really intelligent, like you're a great gadgeteer. You can collapse your vessel, right, into all these other things. And in a representational culture, that flies. For a little while, you can, sell the computer or the gun or the CRISPR or the education. But if you're ripping the boat apart to produce that, and you keep accelerating the pace of that destruction and the number of different ways in which you're accomplishing it, that's the opposite of intelligence. So intelligence has to be, for it to be meaningful, it has to be grounded in awareness. It has to be grounded in active sensing, in participation, in meaningful roles, relationships, and imperatives. And when it departs that ground, it becomes its opposite. Just like that word we. What humans in general and their collectives and institutions have acquired is not intelligence. It's cunning. It's how to make damage look like benefit and profit from that transaction, from that transformation. And in a world with fewer people and less technology, you can get away with that for a while. something will take the damage, and that damage will return to you somehow, because, in case it isn't obvious, Earth's effectively a relatively closed system. If you screw up the basis of the ecologies or you wipe out the atmosphere, you get a dead planet. All games end, and with those endings, all lies also end. But you sacrifice the entire history and future of meaningful organismal development, relation, and behavior forever. That's not intelligent. That's the opposite of intelligence. So until and unless our species begins to form collectives capable of overcoming the fictional collectives and actually enacting something resembling, at least slightly, intelligence, I'm going to suggest that we are not an intelligent species. The fact that we can say the word and make up stories about what that means and pat ourselves on the back for having invented mathematics will not matter at all if all games end. And in fact, I got that wrong. It will matter. We became representationally sophisticated in a broad array of ways that were lethal, both in the sense of causing us to forget the fundamental basis of being, life, organisms, ecologies, the biosphere, relationships, active sensing, awareness, consciousness. We forgot all those things slowly over time, but sometimes dramatically quickly in some phases, like the one we're currently in, where everything's accelerating in a way. The analogy, imagine if you could fall off a cliff and just keep falling faster, which doesn't work in gravity, unless you're rocketing toward the ground with an engine with infinite thrust. That's kind of what happened to the possibility of human intelligence, as our capacity to make things, including representations, including language, proceeded. That's not intelligent. So most of the time these days when I hear the word intelligence, I'm hearing the tolling of a bell that announces 17 new ways for that to be absent, right? Absence as presence, yeah, in language. This is the topic. We can't get to presence in the direction of extinction, of lying, of using sophisticated language to pretend that we're paying attention to something we never developed the faculties to even notice. And that's what's going on the broad scale, in the false collectives, in the institutions at present. And it's extremely difficult to interrupt that process meaningfully because it has incredible momentum and it's hyper instantiated. It's not just everywhere, it's everywhere in 6 new ways each hour, right? If you misguide 7 billion human beings, they can do astronomical amounts of damage in ever-shrinking temporal intervals. That's mostly what's going on. We call it civilization. See? There's another word. The absence of what we're referring to presents as its presence. There's nothing civilized about wiping everything out and turning it all into commodities and obliterating the possibility of human intelligence or integrity or dignity, awareness, consciousness, creativity, play. There's nothing civilized about that. There never was. So you can see this problem's old with our people. It goes way back. In fact, I'd argue that the story in Genesis, perhaps I'd use the word suggest. I'd suggest that the story in Genesis about the tree incident is the story of how this mess got started. We've just failed to understand it in a way that's clear and helps us to see a path through the grave darkness that is the ongoing result of our relationships with representation, language, and knowledge, our capacity to cut things into identities according to purposes that we should mistrust from the outset. And it's not that no one is aware of my concerns or the things I hear speak of. Many people are aware in different ways. But we have not formed collectives that can enact that awareness meaningfully, successfully yet. And even if our species will drag itself and maybe much of life on Earth to extinction right quick, we still have the opportunity to do this, even in very small temporal scales, and we do it naturally. The animal that we are was evolutionarily prepared for this. We're incredible at it. We're as good at this as dolphins are at swimming. We're just being constantly misdirected and intruded upon by fictions that have long historical precedent in the sense that they've become traditional fictions. And in the majority of the population, reign unrecognized, unresisted, unexamined. And for the common people, they may be nearly unexaminable, partly because the contexts in which they're engaged and have membership are formed of these fictions. You can say, like, well, I don't want to work for ExxonMobil, but you're going to have to work for someone unless you're independently wealthy. And even then, if you're independently wealthy, you're still going to depend on ExxonMobil. Unless you're very peculiar and live, in the wilderness on your own. Even then, you'll have some links. So the common people have very little opportunity space to develop we groups that are real and something that actually resembles intelligence. Yet again, our species is made for this. We're just being misled by something that might be likened to false gods. The nature of these processes that have overtaken our collectivity is demonic in the same sense that cancer is malignant. It doesn't really matter whether this is a metaphysical assertion or a utilitarian one. They might as well be demons. They eat everything. They have an insatiable hunger to just obliterate minds and lives, worlds, intelligence. They obliterate we have this other word that means the opposite of what it means, progress. Well, I guess you can call rocketing toward the bottom of a long cliff, that's a kind of progress. But if the end point is smashing into the ground at thousands of miles an hour, was that really progress? And so as humanity is rocketing down the cascade of catastrophes that are disorientation and incredible momentum, right? Apparently, the institutions and the false collectives are capable of framing the acceleration of progress toward a stone wall as progress. They just pretend, well, the wall's not really there. We'll never really hit it. We won't hit it in our lifetimes. As long as it doesn't happen to us, we can offload the damage onto future generations, so on and so forth. So you can see what I mean when I say intelligence, as we generally think of it, in the sense of it being related to the human capacity for insight and for beneficial cooperation in and as nature, in and as humanity. That's nothing like what's going on. I mean, there's tiny little pockets of halfway, intelligent behavior. However, all of that stuff depends on all the unintelligent catastrophizing to produce the possibility of it, right? So it's floating on apocalypse, and it's accelerating apocalypse, not in 1 or 12 or 15 ways, in 1,000 ways, while pretending this is progress. That's not progress. It never was. Once again, we have a word that refers to its own absence as itself. And we should notice together where our linguistic habits incline us to take the shadow-like negation of something, the malignant negation of something, as its presence, as its authentic appearance. It can't be so. On the tiny little island floating in space, the paradise our species arose in and inherited many forms of primacy in. Union is first. It's a meta one first. There's nothing you can hurt here that doesn't... There's no way to externalize harm, right, from a collective or a purpose or an activity that doesn't rebound off unity and come back with dire, catastrophic result. The seeming fact that those results are not always immediate or perceivable is how we're able to play hide the damage in the first place. And what the biosphere does is actually intelligent. It's an actual we group, with the exception primarily of humans, with some few exceptions in that group. And while there's competition and predation, so on, it's not world-wrecking. It doesn't obliterate hope for trillions of other beings just by making a move. And although it produces forms those forms are not properly representations in the sense I use the word. In other words, I have a friend who argues with me, well, you have a nervous system, so starting there, everything's an abstraction to begin with. And I'm like, yeah, I get your point. However, I'm talking about a layer of abstraction that is proper to human thought, conception, cognition, motivation, utilitarian motives, profit motives, power motives, things like this. And while my friend is not incorrect, it's useful to distinguish orders of abstraction in the way that I have. So when I say representation, I'm talking about something that's either a cognitive or a physical artifact of human representational cognition, like this stuff. And particularly when these things masquerade as freedom or wings or new degrees of liberty, we're in serious fucking trouble, and we had best turn about and choose another direction. And if we cannot, and again, I'm using this we word, I'm pretending there's a meaningful collectivity, and it's not entirely untrue. For example, it's my experience that something like the union of all human bodies and minds on Earth right now, and I'm going to limit it temporally just to make it easier, but we don't have to. The union of all human minds and bodies alive on Earth right now comprises an environment. Not so much a network, but a unity from in which networks form and acquire character, perhaps function. So there is a we in the sense that I can feel compassion for someone I've never met, or an animal, or a plant, or an insect. I feel self-likeness with all beings. All beings. But certainly, more profoundly, with the beings I directly encounter in my body. I'm embodied. I'm not a fiction. I'm an actually authentic collective of organs and cells and histories and futures and lineages and purposive imperatives and dreaming. So the word we can point at something meaningful, even though our common usages of it point at primarily its absence. As awareness arises, we can learn to understand the history of the crises I've been describing. And by understanding that history together, we can begin to forge new opportunities, even if their initial scope or interval is very limited. I can have an intelligent conversation with someone I care about, or a stranger, in which for 10 minutes or an hour, we strive together to retrieve the wings our cultures and linguistic habits collapsed into cages. And that's meaningful. It may not change the course of history. It may not change, well, it may not dramatically change the course of history. It changes the course of time and being and minds. However modest the scope of that change may be. And again, I'm not merely suggesting, I'm asserting that we're made for that, we're born for it. That when we feel the return of degrees of liberty in thought and relation and sensing and awareness and consciousness that have long been denied us, degrees we can remember, forms of freedom we can remember from childhood before representational cognition got its clamps on consciousness. We, all of us, began free of that library of frameworks and methods of collapsing frames. And we were rewarded for learning to do that. And our dreaming mind suffered and was eventually evicted from most of our waking awareness. There's an old story here. I mean, this is another gloss on the problem in Genesis at the tree incident. The frameworks have structure, and we can learn this structure. We can learn things about it that return degrees of freedom to consciousness and cognition, to relation, to sensing, to our behavior, to our metabolism, to our minds. And I've spoken about the structure before, but essentially it goes something like the uniphore, the great big circle, which is the everything. The holophores, the meaningful arbiters of identity, meaning, value, function. And then underneath that, layers of tokens that we could call semaphores, meaning likenesses. Right? And for our species, what happened over our representational history is that the uniphore was damaged. That damage was inherited by the holophores and magnified and transmitted among them because they each affect each other. And so by the time we get down to tokens and semaphores, we've got, in modern times, mostly just damage. The process can be reversed by repairing any of the holophores. What is dreaming? What is the sun? What is food really? If we can slightly repair any of the anchors, the world, organisms, humans, minds, hands, eyes, dreaming, food, mother, father, mirror, water. If we can advance our understanding of the holophores so that some of the damage is corrected, that correction becomes contagious first at the layer of other holophores because they all inform each other. And it results in radical downstream corrections to our capacities for representational cognition, particularly the forms that might more reasonably be understood to be intelligent. And what we really mean by intelligent is sort of not deceptive, right? Less wrong. Inherently truthful without being true, because that's a total collapse. Though, in some games within representational minds, truth values are not entirely unrealistic, or as long as their scope is small enough, truth values are okay. If we're doing arithmetic, it's okay to say that 1 plus 1, it's true that it equals 2. In that limited scope of math. But it's not true that 1 plus 1 equals 2, because there's no such thing as 1. 1 is an abstraction of unity. Abstractions of unity, once we're doing that, we're already going in a very dangerous direction that we should at least recognize. We may wish to keep going in that direction, but we should recognize there are no abstractions of unity. There's nothing like that. That's a cognitive game. That's a numero-conceptual game. It's a linguistic game. 1 what? We're not saying 1 what plus 1 what equals 2. We're saying 1 individual, right? Individual what? Are there actually individuals? Of course, we all intuitively understand what's meant by this abstraction, but we should recognize it's an abstraction. And it's a meta-abstraction, because it's saying, just take 2 unities, put them together, you get 2 unities. Is that really true? I mean, you put a man and a woman together, you can get 3 or 4 or 17. I mean, you can get all kinds of unities out of that. And you can say, well, sperms and eggs. And I'm still going to say the same thing. It leads to all kinds of different kinds of unities. So even something as simple as 1 plus 1 equals true, when we examine the assumptions we have to make, the axioms we have to assert and agree with, we find, things are a little bit weirder than the superficial appearance I'm used to relating with. And maybe that's a step in the direction of intelligence together. When this is done meaningfully, with motives that are noble and truthful, that have integrity, they're trustworthy, and they don't lead to the externalization of damage, offloading damage, which is then lied about, which is then again transformed into progress or benefit, profit or power. If everything dies, no one has power. All ideas of power disappear. If the humans die, all ideas of human intelligence and power and goodness and beauty, they all go away. That whole thing just comes to a crashing halt. That can't be progress for humans. And I'm not even going to entertain for the moment the arguments and ideas about, well, maybe it's time for humans to be done. Maybe it is. That's a different topic. I'm talking about things as they lie while humans are still a going concern for us and in nature. The capacity to repair holophores might be part of the fundamental definition of intelligence. And science, strangely, our human relationship with science is an extremely general word, is confusing in that it both gives us useful, pragmatic models and understandings of phenomenon, and drives the capacity for us to depart from intelligence relationally, philosophically, ethically, intellectually. So that's a multi-bladed sword. And our hope lies in the direction of forming collectives capable of resisting the temptations that technology puts on the table for defecting from intelligence and communion, from reverence, from wonder, from awe, from humanity, from life on Earth into new forms of abstraction and warfare and zero-sum games and rivalrous false collectives. We are more delicate than the biosphere, but the biosphere is extremely delicate in the sense of its relationship to the activity of the fictional collectives we've established, sustained, developed, and effectively granted sovereignty over not only each other and our relationships and histories and lineages and families, but of all the beings of this world. Those institutions and collectives are evil in the sense that you don't give the helm of the boat in which all life is held to someone who intends to rip it apart for the sake of the brief appearance of power, authority, dominance, progress. We need to retrieve the boat together. We need to retrieve the wings that are natural to our human essence from the forces that have counterfeited them, obliterated them, deprived us of them, and delivered the appearance of momentary conveniences. But maybe first, we have to form something that actually resembles a we, and be motivated to develop something that actually resembles intelligence. And again, I think we're made for this the way fish are made for water. But we can be captured. We're vulnerable to abstractions and representational cognition and side effects of what we think of as knowledge. In the representational aspect, where there are different kinds of knowledge, not all of which depart into abstraction. The fog is beautiful. The garden is beautiful. I hope perhaps you found some joy or insight in walking with me today as I exercise my body a little bit and try and exercise my mind. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to more time together soon.